We have already begun looking at the differences between the North and the South, and we have seen already the beginning of some major division. The 10th Amendment, remember, is going to allow that any power that is not specifically given to the federal government is reserved for the states and the people in those states. So the southern states specifically, well, really throughout various points in history, both the North and the South have really referred to this amendment. But the South specifically will cling to this amendment and claim its powers multiple times when they are fighting the federal government over, mostly at this point, the issue of slavery, although it did include the issue of tariffs as well. And remember the idea of nullification, that whole idea that states don't have to abide by a law that they believed was unconstitutional. That is going to really come into play here as well, and we had already seen this issue come up multiple times. Now, at the issue of slavery, remember you've got those who were for slavery, pro-slavery advocates, and then those who were obviously against it, with those anti-slavery or abolitionists, those who wanted the emancipation of slaves. But one group we really haven't talked about are those who simply opposed the growth of slavery. They didn't really care about slavery where it already existed. So in those southern states where slavery was already entrenched, they didn't mind that. They just did not want slavery to expand to new areas. Those areas, as we were expanding westward, like we just talked about with the Mexican cession and in Texas, they did not want slavery to expand to those areas. And a lot of that had to do with job competition. They simply wanted to have kind of the upper hand with those jobs. We already seen nullification come into play with the Alien and Sedition Acts that were passed under John Adams' administration and Thomas Jefferson's response with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. We also saw those tariff laws, that 1828 tariff crisis, where the South, specifically South Carolina, threatened to secede, and they would nullify those tariff laws and refuse to abide by them. But we see with slavery, too, that the South basically threatens to nullify any anti-slavery law that was passed at the federal level, basically meaning that they would just simply not abide by that law. And as time goes on, more and more issues become more focused on the region, and it was really solely based on how that region felt about the issue, really more than anything else. For example, the issue of slavery, obviously the North did not want slaves, the South did. Tariffs, the North wanted high tariffs, the South wanted low tariffs, and the fact that their economies were just so different with the industrial North and the agricultural South. So we already see these big differences between these regions. We already discussed the Compromise of 1828, also known as the Missouri Compromise. This is what drew a line right underneath Missouri, right here, and it said that in the future, that first of all, Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, Maine would be admitted as a free state, and then that in the future, anything north of this line would be free, and anything south of the line would be a slave state. Now, this was only a temporary fix. Remember, this does not solve the issue because at the time of this compromise, we did not have any of this land right here. So, this is not going to be a permanent fix by any means, but it does solve that debate for about 20 years. That is until California. The Compromise of 1850 comes about partially because of the addition of all these new lands. The Wilmot Proviso, which you definitely need to know, is going to try to block any slavery in the land that we gained from the Mexican-American War. So remember, we got a big chunk of land from that, all of those states, that most of them would be slave states. So that is going to give us a bunch of land that the Wilmot Proviso tries to keep slavery from expanding into that. Now, the Wilmot Proviso is going to fail. It does not pass, but what's important is that it shows you the intent of where this is going, and the issue of slavery and the expansion of slavery is going to continue to be a major issue. California will apply for statehood because remember, their population exploded so quickly because of the gold rush in 1848 and then in 49, and the debate immediately begins. So, what they come up with, Henry Clay, again, our great compromiser, comes up with this compromise for California to be admitted as a free state. In return for California being a free state, This time there was another state to admit at the same time. So in order to pacify the South, they get a stronger fugitive slave law, which we'll look at in just a minute. And then they determined that in the future, popular sovereignty would be used. Basically, what popular sovereignty is that the residents of those states get to vote on the issue of slavery and whether or not they want to allow slaves in that territory. Now, this is such a very divisive issue that Henry Clay himself gets discouraged because he could not get this passed by himself in one big chunk, and they wound up having to break this down into little pieces and get piece by piece passed. So that was going to be a big issue, but eventually it is passed as the Compromise of 1850 and establishes some very important principles as we move forward. The Underground Railroad was already going on. Now, early on, there were slaves who tried to escape, but those escape measures were really just based on luck. They just basically ran away and hoping that they could either get into Indian territory where they would just kind of live out in the woods, or make it as far south or mostly as far north as they could. But as time went on, there became a more organized method. So what this turned into was a network of anti-slavery advocates who basically were there. And remember, this is a very secret kind of group of people who worked to free these slaves. So this is going to be really important here. And they always had to travel by night. And they had to rely on secret messages. Now, if you were one that tried to help these slaves escape, you would be put just as much at risk as the escaped slaves themselves. But really, in order to be totally free, they had to go all the way to Canada. And many of these slaves simply did not want to go all the way to Canada. That was a long way. Remember, they're going on foot. So most of the time, once they got north of the Mason-Dixon line, they just stopped and they began to live in the South, in the North, as free people and could kind of blend in with the rest of the free black population in the North. Now, Harriet Tubman, who is pictured here on the right, is the most famous conductor of the Underground Railroad. Remember, the Underground Railroad is not an actual railroad. We simply call it that because it had various stations where it moved these escaped slaves or runaway slaves along. She alone helped around 400 slaves escape. I mean, she was really very vital to this mission to get those runaways to the North. Now, this stronger fugitive slave law is going to be really key. It is going to allow, remember, this is part of the Compromise of 1850, it allowed slave catchers to go into free areas to capture runaway slaves. So this had not been allowed in the past. So now, basically, a slave catcher who was employed by the slave owner could go into any area to try to capture that runaway slave. It made it a crime to help a runaway slave, so all of those people on the Underground Railroad are now at even more risk. It also said that if you were a suspected slave, you were not given a trial, and you were also not given a chance to testify. So if you were accused, even if you weren't a runaway slave, you had absolutely no way to defend yourself. So this is going to be very difficult. And really now, because of this law, every free African American in the North is now at risk of being taken into slavery because of the accusation made. So this is really a law that impacts all African Americans in the United States. Now, the North hated this law. They hated it so much that they are going to pass, now this should kind of remind you of those nullification laws. They passed things called personal liberty laws. And these personal liberty laws were going to be in direct violation to the Fugitive Slave Law or Fugitive Slave Act. And it says that they would be given a chance to testify. They would also often offer free legal aid to kind of try to drag out these court cases to keep those, to make it so expensive for the slave owner that they would basically just kind of give up and go home. So this is what we see beginning to happen in the North in response to the Fugitive Slave Law. And we see the South being very angry over this because they felt like this was their part of the Compromise of 1850 and that they were not getting the fair shake on their end of the deal.